How could humanity have been created? For thousands of years, people have been searching for the answer to this question. Every society has tried to provide different answers based on its own beliefs. But when we examine the oldest tablets, some of the stories told about creation are truly astonishing. Moreover, these tablets date back to periods even older than the Bible. One can't help but start to wonder, where did ancient people learn these stories about creation? Or did they influence one another to create similar narratives? Historians have been debating these questions for many years. Now let's take a look together at what these tablets, written thousands of years ago, have to say about these events. The Sumerians are one of the most misrepresented civilizations in popular culture. The internet has made them famous primarily through the Anunnaki theories associated with the writer Archaeology, whose books propose that Sumerian texts describe an alien species that genetically engineered humanity. These theories are not taken seriously by any credentialed Assyriologist or ancient Near Eastern scholar. But the misrepresentation has obscured something genuinely extraordinary: what the Sumerians actually were and what they actually accomplished. The Sumerians were the inhabitants of the southernmost region of Mesopotamia, the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. They were not a race in the modern genetic sense, but a linguistic and cultural community identified primarily by their language, Sumerian, a language isolate with no known relatives, completely unrelated to the Semitic languages of their neighbors. They appear in the archaeological record in the 5th millennium BCE and reached their cultural peak between approximately 3100 and 2000 BCE. What the Sumerians achieved in this period is genuinely staggering. They developed the world's first writing system, cuneiform, initially for administrative purposes, keeping track of grain, livestock, and labor, but rapidly expanding it into literature, law, medicine, astronomy, and theology. The city of Uruk, in the 4th millennium BCE, was almost certainly the largest urban settlement in the world at that time, with an estimated population of between 40,000 and 80,000 people. The Sumerians built the first monumental architecture, developed the first formal legal codes, organized the first known school system, and produced the first named author in human history, a woman named Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god Inanna at who lived around 2285 BCE and wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna that are still read today. The Sumerian King List, a cuneiform document listing the rulers of Mesopotamian cities from the legendary beginnings of civilization, presents kings before the flood who ruled for tens of thousands of years, followed by the flood itself, followed by post-flood kings with decreasing but still extraordinary reign lengths that gradually approach historical plausibility. The structural parallel to the Genesis genealogies, the long-lived antediluvian patriarchs, the flood as the dividing event, the post-flood generations with shorter lifespans, is not incidental. The literary achievement of the Sumerians is worth dwelling on because it is so frequently overshadowed by the Anunnaki mythology that dominates popular discussion of the civilization. Enheduanna's hymns to Inanna are genuine literature, complex, emotionally sophisticated, politically engaged documents that describe the goddess's power in language that anticipates the Hebrew Psalms by more than a millennium. The Sumerian lament texts, which mourn the destruction of the great cities of Sumer by invading Semitic populations, represent a literary tradition of collective grief over urban destruction that may have directly influenced the Book of Lamentations' response to the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. The Sumerian wisdom texts, which include proverbs, debates, and philosophical meditations on the human condition, represent a tradition of reflective literature that prefigures the Hebrew wisdom literature of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. The Sumerians were eventually absorbed into the broader Akkadian cultural sphere as Semitic-speaking populations became dominant in Mesopotamia. The Sumerian language ceased to be spoken as a living language sometime around 2000 BCE, but it continued to be used as a literary and religious language for nearly 2,000 years afterward, the way Latin continued to be used in European scholarship long after it stopped being anyone's native tongue. The texts that record Sumerian mythology and theology were copied and recopied by generations of Babylonian and Assyrian scribes, who preserved them in the same libraries that eventually produced the Gilgamesh Epic and the Atrahasis Epic. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation epic, named for its opening words, which mean "when on high" in Akkadian. It was discovered among the tablets of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, the same library that produced the Gilgamesh flood tablet that George Smith identified in 1872. The Enuma Elish was first translated by George Smith's colleague, and its relationship to Genesis 1 has been debated intensively ever since. The Enuma Elish describes a creation that begins with undifferentiated primordial waters, Apsu, the freshwater deep, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, mingling together before any gods or anything else existed. The mixing of these two waters generates the first gods. The primordial condition is one of undifferentiated watery chaos. Creation consists of imposing order and separation on that chaos. Genesis 1 opens with a description that is structurally similar. The earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters. The Hebrew word translated as deep, Tehem, is linguistically related to the name Tiamat. The sequence of creation in Genesis 1, separation of waters above and below, separation of land and sea, then the population of the created world with plants, animals, and finally humans, follows a logic of imposing order on primordial chaos that parallels the Enuma Elish's organizational structure. The Babylonian scholar George Smith published his initial comparison of the Enuma Elish and Genesis in 1876, 4 years after his Gilgamesh discovery. His work triggered a scholarly controversy that produced what became known in the early 20th century as the Pan-Babylonian school, the argument that Hebrew religion and literature were essentially derived from Babylonian sources. This position is now considered too extreme. The relationship between the two traditions is more complex than simple derivation. What the current scholarly consensus supports is a model of shared tradition rather than direct literary borrowing. Both Genesis and the Enuma Elish are drawing on a common ancient Near Eastern conceptual vocabulary for describing creation, the primordial waters, the divine spirit moving over those waters, the separation of the created world from undifferentiated chaos, the special status of humans within the created order. This shared vocabulary predates both texts. The question is not whether Genesis copied the Enuma Elish, but how both texts are engaging with a common cultural inheritance and what they are each doing with it. The most important observation is about difference rather than similarity. The Enuma Elish is a creation story organized around divine conflict. Tiamat is a monster who must be killed before creation can happen, and the world is made from her body. Genesis 1 is a creation story organized around divine speech. God speaks, and what God speaks comes into being. The theological difference is fundamental. The Genesis authors were not simply reproducing the Babylonian tradition. They were transforming it, replacing divine conflict with divine word, replacing the chaos monster with the creative power of speech. The Atrahasis Epic's account of human creation is the most theologically explicit of the Mesopotamian texts that parallel the Genesis creation narrative, and it is worth examining in detail because its specificity reveals both the similarities to Genesis and the profound differences. In the Atrahasis Epic, the creation of humans is a response to a labor crisis. The lesser gods, the Igigi, have been doing the physical work of maintaining the world, digging the rivers and canals that organized Mesopotamian agriculture. After 40 years of this labor, they revolt. The senior gods convene to find a solution. The birth goddess Mami, also called Nintu, is commissioned to create a substitute laborer. She creates the first human from clay mixed with the blood of a god who is slaughtered specifically for this purpose. A god identified as having intelligence, so that the human will inherit cognitive capacity. The purpose is explicit and functional. Humans are created to bear the burden. The Sumerian word for human, Lulu, is sometimes interpreted as meaning the mixed one, the being that combines divine and earthly substance. But the primary function is labor. Humans exist to do the work that the gods no longer want to do, to grow the food that will be offered as sacrifice so that the gods can eat. The Genesis account of human creation in Genesis 2 shares some structural features with this tradition. Humans are formed from the dust of the ground. Something divine is breathed into them. They are placed in a garden and given work to do, to cultivate and keep it. But the purpose is entirely different. In Genesis, humans are not created to relieve the gods of labor. They are created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, and given dominion over the created order. The relationship between the divine and the human is not one of servant and master, but of image and original. The Sumerian text, known as the debate between sheep and grain, which describes the gods creating agriculture for human benefit after humans initially lived like animals eating grass and drinking water from ditches, presents a picture of human development from a pre-agricultural state that has interesting parallels to both the Eden narrative and to what archaeology has established about the actual transition from hunter-gatherer to agricultural life in the ancient Near East. The specific detail of human creation from clay is worth examining because it appears across multiple ancient Near Eastern traditions in ways that illuminate both its cultural ubiquity and its theological adaptability. In the Egyptian tradition, the god Khnum fashions humans on a potter's wheel from Nile clay. In the Greek tradition, Prometheus creates humans from clay. The widespread distribution of this motif across unrelated traditions suggests that it reflects something genuine about ancient human intuition about the relationship between the human body and the earth. An intuition that modern biochemistry has confirmed in the sense that the elements of the human body are precisely the elements of the Earth's crust. The theological difference between the traditions lies not in the clay, but in what else goes into the creation. Divine blood in the Mesopotamian version, divine breath in Genesis, the specific craftsmanship of a divine potter in the Egyptian version, the site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, excavated since 1994 and dated to approximately 9600 BCE, predates agriculture. Its massive carved stone enclosures, built by hunter-gatherer communities, suggest a level of social and cognitive complexity in pre-agricultural humans that does not fit the simple progression from animal-like existence to civilization that both the Sumerian texts and the Genesis narrative imply. The relationship between the textual traditions and the actual archaeological record of human cognitive and cultural development is one of the most interesting active research questions in the study of human origins. The physical archaeology of Sumerian civilization has produced some of the most important discoveries in the history of ancient Near Eastern scholarship, and the material evidence both confirms and complicates the picture that the literary texts present. The excavation of by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 remains one of the most significant archaeological projects ever conducted. Woolley's team uncovered the Royal Cemetery of a burial complex containing 16 royal tombs dated to approximately 2600 to 2450 BCE. The tombs revealed an extraordinary concentration of wealth and artistic achievement. Golden helmets, lyres decorated with the heads of bulls, elaborate gold and lapis lazuli jewelry, and the objects that made Woolley's discovery world famous. The so-called ram in a thicket, a pair of standing figures of a ram with its forelegs caught in a thicket of gold and lapis lazuli flowers, an object whose iconographic relationship to the Genesis 22 story of Abraham and the ram caught in the thicket has been noted by multiple scholars. The royal cemetery also revealed something more disturbing: the practice of human sacrifice. Multiple royal tombs contain the remains of dozens of attendants, soldiers, musicians, ladies-in-waiting, who appear to have voluntarily taken poison and died with their masters. The evidence for this practice, which Woolley described as the death pit, provides a physical context for understanding the social organization of the Sumerian world that the literary texts present only partially. The excavation of Nippur by American teams between 1889 and 1900 produced the most important collection of Sumerian literary texts ever found. Nippur was the religious center of the Sumerian world, the home of the supreme god Enlil, and its scribal schools produced and preserved an extraordinary archive of literary, religious, and administrative texts. The Nippur tablets include the most complete version of the Sumerian flood narrative, the Sumerian king list, and a substantial portion of the Sumerian literary canon. The city of Uruk, excavated by German teams beginning in 1912, has produced the physical evidence for the transition to writing. The earliest known writing, pictographic clay tablets from the end of the 4th millennium BCE, comes from Uruk, along with the cylinder seals, stamp seals, and administrative tokens that preceded the development of cuneiform. The Uruk evidence makes it possible to watch the development of writing as a response to administrative complexity. The need to keep track of large quantities of goods in a large urban economy, rather than as a sudden invention or a gift from the divine. The site of Eridu, traditionally regarded in the Sumerian tradition as the oldest city and the first place where kingship descended from heaven, has been excavated since the 1940s. The Eridu excavations revealed a sequence of temples going back to approximately 5400 BCE, among the oldest religious structures ever found. The sequence documents the continuous development of the sacred building tradition that eventually produced the massive ziggurats of the later Sumerian and Babylonian periods. The relationship between the Sumerian literary tradition and the Hebrew Bible is not a simple one of source and derivation. It is better understood as a dialogue, two traditions engaging with a common cultural inheritance in different ways, sometimes confirming each other's historical memory, sometimes diverging sharply in their theological interpretation of shared material. The most straightforward category of confirmation involves geography and historical memory. The Sumerian king list names cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Sippar, Shuruppak, Larak, as the centers of antediluvian civilization. These are real places whose archaeology confirms their ancient occupation. When the list describes the flood as the dividing event between the antediluvian world and the historical world, it is preserving a genuine cultural memory of the transition from the pre-flood period, whatever physical event or events that memory encodes, to the historical world of the Sumerian city-states. The Genesis Table of Nations in Genesis 10, which describes the descendants of Noah's sons as the ancestors of the nations of the known world, includes a geographical and ethnic framework that corresponds in significant ways to the actual distribution of peoples and languages in the ancient Near East, as known from both archaeology and external historical sources. The Hamitic nations correspond roughly to the Afroasiatic language family. The Semitic nations correspond to the actual distribution of Semitic-speaking peoples. The Japhethic nations correspond roughly to the Indo-European language family. The Table of Nations is not an accurate linguistic classification by modern standards, but it reflects genuine ancient knowledge of the human geographical distribution of the world known to its authors. The city of Shinar, which appears in Genesis 10 and 11 as the location of the Tower of Babel narrative, is the Hebrew form of the Sumerian geographic term Sumer, or more specifically, of the Akkadian form Shumer. The Genesis author's identification of Babel as a city in Shinar is the direct application of the Sumerian geographic vocabulary to the setting of their narrative. This is not mythological invention, it is geographical memory. The figure of Nimrod in Genesis 10, 8-12, described as a mighty hunter before the Lord who founded the cities of Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar, has been the subject of extensive scholarly analysis. Erech is Uruk. Akkad is the city of the Akkadian Empire. The passage preserves a memory of the political geography of early Mesopotamia embedded in the genealogical framework of the Table of Nations. The most theologically significant convergence is the shared understanding that humans occupy a unique position in the created order, neither fully divine nor fully animal, and that this unique position carries both distinctive capacity and distinctive responsibility. The Sumerian texts express this through the concept of the mixed nature of humanity, combining divine blood with earthly clay. The Genesis texts express it through the concept of the image of God. The philosophical content is different, but both traditions are grappling with the same fundamental question. What is the human being, and why does the human being exist? The discovery and translation of the Sumerian and Babylonian literary corpus over the past century and a half has permanently changed the scholarly landscape within which the Hebrew Bible is read. It has also, paradoxically, made the Genesis narratives more interesting rather than less. The initial reaction to the discovery of the Mesopotamian parallels in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was often either anxious defense of biblical uniqueness or triumphant dismissal of the Bible as derivative mythology. Both reactions missed what the evidence actually shows. What the comparative evidence shows is that the Genesis authors were sophisticated literary and theological thinkers operating within a shared ancient Near Eastern cultural tradition and deliberately transforming that tradition to express their own distinctive theological vision. They were not copying, they were answering. The Enuma Elish says creation required divine conflict. Genesis says creation required divine speech. The Atrahasis Epic says humans were created to do the God's work. Genesis says humans were created in God's image. The differences are not accidental, they are the argument. The dating of the Genesis texts is itself a relevant question. The scholarly consensus, developed through the documentary hypothesis and its successors, places the composition and compilation of the Genesis narratives primarily in the period from the 10th to the 5th centuries BCE, the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE, the period when the Judean elite were living in Babylon, in the culture that had produced and preserved the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis Epic, is widely regarded as a crucial period for the development of the Genesis traditions in their current form. This means that the Genesis creation narrative and the Mesopotamian creation texts were not simply parallel traditions developing independently. The authors of the Genesis narrative in its current form were almost certainly familiar with the Mesopotamian tradition. The question is what they did with that familiarity, and the answer is that they used it to make an argument about the nature of God, the nature of humanity, and the meaning of creation. That was directly responsive to the Babylonian theological tradition within which they were living. The Babylonian exile deserves particular attention as the context within which the Genesis creation narrative likely reached its current form. The exiled Judean community living in Babylon in the 6th century BCE was surrounded by the physical monuments of Babylonian theological confidence: the Esagila temple complex, the Etemenanki ziggurat, the Akitu festival that celebrated the creation of the world according to the Enuma Elish narrative. The Babylonian creation story was not an academic curiosity for the exiles. It was the dominant public theology of the empire that had conquered them, destroyed their temple, and displaced them from their land. The Genesis creation narrative in this context is not simply a cosmological account. It is a theological argument addressed to a specific historical situation. When Genesis 1 says that God spoke and light came into being, it is making a claim directly counter to the Babylonian claim that creation required divine conflict and the destruction of a chaos monster. When Genesis says humans were created in the image of God, it is making a claim directly counter to the Babylonian claim that humans were created to relieve the gods of labor. The Genesis narrative is answering the Babylonian theology with an alternative theology, and the exiles knew it. The Sumerian contribution to the biblical tradition is thus not a threat to the theological significance of the Genesis narrative. It is the context that makes the theological argument of Genesis visible. You can only see what Genesis is arguing if you know what it is arguing against. Even if thousands of years pass, isn't the essence of humanity always the same? We all share certain questions that intrigue us. How were we created? Why do we exist? And where will we go one day? The Sumerians, too, were searching for the answers to these questions. Later, other civilizations also tried to answer the same questions from their own perspectives. Perhaps that's why some of the stories told by different societies are so similar. To be honest, that's what I found most interesting, because civilizations changed, but the questions people ask never changed. So, what do you think about this? Has the fact that the Sumerian tablets predate the Bible changed your perspective on these narratives?